Uh, Thanks very much, Jacob. That was a really exciting and well-focused introduction. Maybe made my job redundant, sort of at this stage in time. One of the things that I've been struggling with when I look at the issue of civilization is to try to break out from the way it's generally discussed and represented, because I think that it's a rather stale discussion on all the different sides. It's almost as if we're stuck in a different era and find it very difficult to contextualize its contemporary development. So what I'm going to try to do in introducing the subject is essentially, first of all, to talk a little bit about what civilization is in the way that I see it. Secondly, to go on and explain why civilization, and in particular Western civilization, is in trouble. And thirdly, to look more closely at its enemies, the enemies of civilization, and why it is that they've gone from strength to strength in the recent period. And I think in many respects what I really want to emphasize is that civilization is not a thing. It's not a material phenomenon. It is really much more than that. Now, in the course of my introduction, I'm going to be not ad-libbing as much as I usually do, because it's quite a kind of complex subject. And if any of you find it difficult at times to follow my argument, I've written a Substack on the lecture, which just came online this morning, so you can read that and maybe you can leave now and and find that a little bit easier to do. So, first of all, civilization is not simply about dramatic symbols of human achievements, nor is it about the development of complex technologies and sophisticated techniques of social organization. It is also about cultural values and about a particular web of meaning that has emerged historically and cultivated by different societies. And I think it's through the internalization of this cultural orientation towards a system of values that a consciousness of civilization emerges. It is, for me, very important to understand that there's an important distinction between civilization in the way that it's generally discussed and what I'll call the consciousness of civilization, because it's our consciousness of civilization that ultimately influences and determines what we think of it, the way it's discussed, and it's and also the reactions that it provokes. It's the implication of the loss of this consciousness that I'm really concerned about, and I'm really trying to do a lot of work on to understand why it is that we've lost something that has been so deeply embedded in the historical period of modern times. Why is it that we no longer feel able to have that kind of sense of consciousness about what civilizing is, what civilization means, what even being civil is really all about? I begin with the anthropologist, Professor Alfred Kroeber, who gave a lecture on October 27, 1950, in Chicago, and he basically explained that the most characteristic part of civilization, which we may call value culture, is not their only component. He added, there's also what may be called reality culture, concerned with finding out, mastering, and directing nature, and sometimes mastering and directing fellow men as well. Technology, the useful arts, ways of successful practical living are the avenues by which reality culture is expressed. And then went on to say that there's a third component, social structures and relations, which in principle might be thought of to be independent of the rest of civilization or culture, because it also occurs well developed among cultureless, non-symbolizing animals, especially social insects. But he adds, human societies always operate with symbols and thus possess culture. Their social structure and relations are channeled into variable cultural forms instead of being constant, autonomous, and mainly hereditary. So social culture, which he says is man, is always interwoven with value culture and reality culture. And what he's really pointing out is that through the symbolization of cultural experiences, humanity opens itself up to an ever-changing sort of dynamic, an ever-changing process. And therefore civilizations, at least our consciousness of civilization, never stays still. It's always susceptible to a transience and change and variability. It is evident that in the first instance, civilization is, as Samuel Huntington argued, the broadest cultural entity. I know that Samuel Huntington is hated and criticized by a lot of people, but actually when you read the book, there are some very interesting insights that he puts forward. And he puts forward what I think is the best definition of what civilization is. He says, villages, regions, ethnic groups, nationalities, religious groups all have distinct cultures at different levels of cultural heterogeneity. The culture of a village in southern Italy may be different from that of a village in northern Italy, but both will share a common Italian culture that distinguishes them from German villages. European communities, in turn, will share cultural features that distinguish them from the Chinese or Hindu communities. And basically, what he's really getting at is that what you have is this very big, broad concept that constitutes civilizations. It's the highest cultural grouping of people and what he calls the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of what distinguishes them or distinguishes humans from other species. So with civilization, invariably, there's a very clear link with being human. And in many respects, one of the important developments of Western civilization was this powerful humanist impulse, which kind of kicked in, particularly from the Renaissance onward. So, nevertheless, what I think is important here is that we need to distinguish the distinct cultural forms assumed by civilization from those which pertain to the realm of consciousness of civilization. The idea of civilization, and I think this is probably the most important point for me, and its development as a concept, presupposes the existence of historical consciousness. Without historical consciousness, there is no civilization. That's a very important point to realize. Ancient civilizations lacked such a consciousness, which is why they had no need for such a concept. I mean, the Greeks, the Romans, did not have a concept of civilization. They might have had a concept of being different than the barbarians, and they might have a sense of being different than the others. But the idea of a concept of civilization was not something they needed, for the very simple reason that they lacked a consciousness of history. And it really wasn't until you have a consciousness of history that civilization emerges and gains currency as a form of consciousness, particularly in the 18th century, mainly the 18th century, when that consciousness really begins to kick in. And that's why it's in the 18th century that even the word civilization begins to be used. Initially, there was a lot of resistance to using the word civilization when it first began to emerge in France and later in England. But then gradually it gained currency, and the Germans, as Jacob was indicating, tried to kind of resist that for a very long time. So although there is a very clear conceptual distinction between civilization in the way that Kroeber expressed it and Western civilizational thinking, they're actually very closely linked. I think that in many respects, what we have to understand is that civilization, in the way that I'm describing it, is integral to the emergence of the self-consciousness of the West. It's when the West begins to develop a consciousness of itself as being something that transcends being French or German or anything else, and even transcends the pre-existing sense of being part of a Christian universal sort of entity. It's at that point that the consciousness of civilization gains definition. Norbert Elias, the sociologist, who sometimes is very good, sometimes is very bad, basically said that the concept of civilization expresses the self-consciousness of the West. It sums up everything in which Western society of the last 2 or 3 centuries believes itself superior to earlier societies or more primitive contemporary ones. By this term, Western society seeks to describe what constitutes its special character, what it is proud of, the level of its technology, the nature of its manners, the development of its scientific knowledge or view of the world, and much more. So basically, the point that comes out of this is that civilization, the concept of civilization, is not merely one of description. It's not a neutral category, and never has been. It is a term of description that describes what's distinct about the Egyptians or what's distinctive about Chinese civilization, but it is much more than that. Because the minute you have a consciousness of civilization, you also have a very strong normative orientation. But civilization is really about norms, it's really about values. It's about the value distinctions between your civilization and those of others. So we not only have what's called an ethnographical view of civilization, which is essentially a descriptive one, we also have a normative one. And gradually, with the passing of time, what becomes important about civilization and civilizational debates and discussion is its normative dimension, something that today goes against the very grain of everything that we discuss, because the domain of normativity relates to the domain of judgment, and in particular to that of moral judgment. Because basically, when you talk about civilization, you're making a statement of value just by basically making a contrast between the civilized and the uncivilized, the civilized and the primitive. You have a variety of counter-concept, contrast, moral contrast that are contained within it. Never mind the distinction between Western civilization and Chinese or Hindu or other civilizations, which presumably, as a Westerners, you might assume involve a very clear statement whereby you see yourself as being superior to other civilization. So, in a sense, when we're talking about describing our civilization, Western civilization, you historically see it as being beautiful, you see it as being unique, you see it as being universal, you see its qualities as being, in some shape or form, not just different, but also as having qualities attached to it that are at a higher level than that of other civilization. And these days you cannot say that. I mean, I don't know if you noticed it. You know, you cannot even use the word superior without inviting the tone of disparagement. Now, Lucien Febvre, who's the French historian, who wrote wonderfully about the development, the genealogy of civilization, what it really means, basically explained this development in this way. He said, we have an idea that civilization we are talking about, ours, is in itself something great and beautiful, something too which is nobler, more comfortable and better, both morally and materially speaking, than anything outside of it. Savagery, barbarity, semi-civilization. Finally, we are confident that such a civilization in which we participate, which we propagate, benefit from, and popularize, bestows on us certain value, prestige, and dignity. Now, when Febvre said this, it was in 1930 when he gave this lecture. And in the 1930s, this conception of civilization was pretty much universally accepted within the Western world and outside, and even outside the Western world, in places like Japan and Africa and parts of the Middle East. It actually accurately captured the concept of civilization in the 1930s, because at this point in time, the concept of Western civilization communicated a positive and even idealized form of self-consciousness. However, in our era, civilization and the way it's perceived, the way the concept is used, is almost its very opposite. I mean, someone like what Lucien Febvre said would be seen as being antithetical to good taste. There's a really wonderful way that this is described by the American historian James Hankins, whose book is coming out next month, and I would advise people to read it. It's a really good, fierce fighter for Western civilization from an American perspective. But the way he explains the problem today is this. He says, in recent time, we have seen spread to our schools and institutions an improper and uncivilized humility, a malicious form of humility indistinguishable from self-hatred. This is a humanity that humiliates, that seeks to blind Westerners to their magnificent traditions and to rub their noses like miserable dogs in their worst offenses. The effect is not the goal of this movement of self-humiliation, but it's to make Westerners ashamed of their own civilization and to take away from us the very inheritance of our parents, ancestors, worked so hard to develop. It makes us reluctant to add to that inheritance and pass it on to those who will come after that. Now, there are many reasons that this is something we really have to struggle with. There are very many reasons why the way we look at civilization today is so fundamentally different than the way that Lucien Febvre talked about it in the 1930s. Obviously, the concept of Western civilization acquired often an unhealthy ideological form that communicated claims about racial and cultural superiority. In the 19th century, the idea of civilizational mission was used to legitimate imperialism and colonial domination, and therefore it acquired an understandably negative connotation in some places. However, I argue that the reason why Western civilization has been devalued and lost its moral authority is not because of the moment of imperialism or because of the way some people instrumentalize it to justify racial domination. I think the main driver of Western society's alienation from its civilizational accomplishment is the ascendancy of a negative representation of the act of judgment. In the contemporary world, judgment has an entirely negative connotation to the point that its opposite, non-judgmentalism, as I argued before, has become the foundational value of contemporary Western culture. And that is why in academic circles, the concept of civilization always comes with a health warning. I looked at a lot of university courses which touch on the West, and invariably they always have a kind of almost like a trigger warning, which basically argues that you've got to be very careful. So, for example, it's suggested that it's morally wrong to make a contrast between civilization and non-literate communities. It's called racism and cultural arrogance. It's very often argued that if you're an anthropologist or an archaeologist or historian or sociologist, you cannot work with civilizational concepts because they imply a value judgment. It implies the notion that civilization is better than non-civilization, and is in some shape or form, civilization is superior to things that have preceded it or non-civilized communities. So there's almost this kind of fear of being caught out discriminating or implying that one form of organization is superior to another. And there's that kind of reluctance to see these differences, and not just merely differences, but having a moral connotation to it that is really quite important. So what this means is that the celebration of non-judgmentalism implies that what was in the past seen as entirely obvious, which is that civilization is better and more advanced than other forms of social organization, has become a view that runs counter to the narrative that dominates contemporary society. Non-judgmentalism, which at times acquires the pathological form of judgment phobia, in a sense threatens to dispossess Western societies of their traditional source of the meaning, their meaning which is founded in their civilizational accomplishment. That is why, and this is to me the key point here, the ruling classes of the Western world are so reluctant to put in a good word about civilization, their civilization legacy. They basically have lost faith in their own civilization to the point that they're not prepared to defend it against its opponents. So what's happening? What happened is that with the estrangement of civilizational consciousness from everyday life, it only takes a matter of time before that kind of reluctance to defend your civilizational accomplishment leads to a sense of defeatism and almost like a form of cultural treason, which is basically what has happened. The American historian Daniel Gordon has observed that of all the terms in modern social science, none is more reviled by academics today than civilization. There's no single concept in the social sciences that carries so much negative baggage as that of civilization. And as the Cambridge historian Richard Toombs remarked, attacking Western civilization would have seemed eccentric in 1989. Now it seems to be the tide of history. And I could go on about the way that cultural institutions in the West have basically adopted a form of curation which is self-consciously anti-civilizational and which continually sort of represents Western civilization as really, really bad. I mean, virtually every sin that I can think of, cultural sin that exists at the moment, is linked to civilization. So, for example, this American sociologist, Roger Brubaker, asserts that Western civilization and those who uphold it are really catering to populism. And because populism in his eyes is the worst thing that you could be in the world, therefore, by that mere fact alone, Western civilization is negated. And he argues that populist movements have embraced what he calls civilizationism. He invents this word civilizationism to suggest that it is somehow comparable to the concept of racism or xenophobia or the rest of that. I've decided to embrace the concept of civilizationism, rather than say no, in the way that I embrace populism, rather than say no, I'm not a populist. Just because, to some extent, sometimes we have got to subvert the kind of discourse that this kind of puts forward. And basically what he argues is that civilizationism is the weaponization of Western ideals by far-right identitarian activists. I think what he's really getting at is that if you take Europe, it is merely what they call the far-right populist movements who take civilization, Western civilization, Christian civilization, and all the elements that are linked to it positively and seriously, and therefore the whole package has got to be negated. Hostility to the concept of Western civilization has led to its abolishment from courses. And even when they talk about it in universities, it's interesting the language they use. So, for example, at the University of Texas, not exactly the high point of intellectual achievement, there's a course that's called The Myths of Western Civilization, and goes on, Myths of Western Civilization, Decolonizing and Queering European History. Yeah. I mean, imagine paying good money to sit around to listen to that. And it offers the content warning, which says much of European history is and should be disturbing. It often involves violence, queerphobia, racism, classism, sexism, and xenophobia. And that kind of statement, in an academic institution, that kind of ahistorical reading history backwards, has become normalized to the point at which, sort of history and the past, particularly of civilization, is kind of represented in that negative, destructive way. Decolonization, which we all know and love, when you explore it closer, actually means de-civilization. Right? I was very proud of myself. I thought that I'd invented the term de-civilization. And I was going to tell the world, another Furedi achievement. Look what has happened. Until I came across a couple of people in India who already used the term, and I thought this is a bit cheeky on their part, but nevertheless, at least you know that you're going in the right direction when other people also kind of draw very similar kind of conclusions. So the point here is with decolonization is this: the loss of confidence in its civilizational accomplishment by its cultural elites has encouraged and empowered anti-Western opponents to go on the offensive. In any case, opponents of colonialism during the 20th century understandably criticized Western civilization as a medium of oppression. It's entirely understandable. If I'm a Kenyan citizen, it's quite understandable. I don't think colonialism is the best thing that's ever happened to us, necessarily. But as Makarand Paranjape pointed out, he's an Indian philosopher, for the colonized, the critique of modern Western civilization became essential to the anti-colonial struggle. That is, because the colonizers had tried to legitimize their expansionist and exploitative enterprise of empire building as the white man's civilizing mission or burden. Now, tragically, from the 1960s onwards, an entirely legitimate anti-colonial critique of the ideological instrumentalization of Western civilization became entwined with the growing influence of a non-judgmental cultural sensibility of the times. This is where the turn really kicks in and begins to happen. And at that point, what happens is that anti-colonialism, which is entirely legitimate, an entirely legitimate nationalist response, comes under the spell of Western identity politics and multiculturalism. And that kind of mix is really, that kind of brew becomes really important. But what's really interesting here, and I want you to think about this and maybe give me your views on this, perversely, a new form of anti-Westernism emerged, which was based on the ideological resources developed in Western universities and cultural institutions. So many of the anti-Western manifestations that we see, from decolonization to the Hamas, Islamist kind of perspective, are really based upon not kind of traditional Islam or traditional this, they're actually based upon this brew of multiculturalism, identity politics, and anti-colonialism, a new form. So the new synthesis of Western identity politics and traditional form of anti-colonialism was most systematically expressed by the American Black Power movement in the 1960s. One of its leaders, Stokely Carmichael, explained, when you talk of Black Power, you talk of building a movement that will smash everything Western civilization has created. So you want to smash everything that Western civilization created. And at this point, the mutation of an anti-colonial critique of Western civilization into a nihilistic call for the destruction of everything it has created gained momentum. Why? Because it ran alongside the development of identity politics, which then begins to expand at that stage in time. On January 15th, 1987, I remember this because I'm old enough to remember this, 1987, the American civil rights activist Jesse Jackson and around 500 protesters marched down Palm Drive, Stanford University's main entrance, chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go." And this event actually marked the beginning of the end of teaching Western civilizational courses in American universities. In the academy throughout the Anglo-American world, multiculturalism displaced the study of Western culture. It's an important shift that begins to occur. And academia and our political leaders were so cowardly that they just simply rolled over and just allowed this to happen. And when you look at the way that the church has reacted, the way that the academics reacted, the way that politicians reacted, they had no idea that what they were doing was essentially committing or trying to kind of commit some kind of civilizational suicide. But you see, the moment you give way on teaching Western civilization, every single course, every academic discipline becomes potentially the target of decivilizationism, right? Of decolonization. And that's why you'll find that the mere association of the word Western was sufficient to denounce mathematics, philosophy, and even scientific subjects for their civilizational associations. And I know that many conservative friends of mine often, sort of helplessly laugh. Isn't it crazy that they're criticizing mathematics for being Western? Ho, 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 ho. How could they say that? Not realizing that for the last 30 years, last 40 years, this trend has been evolving and gaining influence. And obviously, once you begin to give way, it crystallizes into the most irrational of reactions to every single discipline that is around. And soon, the synthesis of non-judgmentalism and identity politics became a driver for a discourse that was not merely anti-Western, but also anti-civilization. As Ibrahim X. Kendi, they always have the name X in there, sort of. Yeah. This is before Twitter became X, by the way. A leading ideologue of what I would call racist anti-racism said, civilization itself is often a polite euphemism for cultural racism. So you have this kind of development of a very negative account of civilization. And in effect, what has happened is that the demonization of civilization has become integral to the ideological worldview of identity politics. Now, a lot of people haven't noticed this because identity ideologues aren't very systematic or very coherent in what they say about their outlook. But if you go back 30, 40 years, you can see that gradually that hatred towards Western civilization, often unsaid, unspoken, but for all that very, very real, becomes really, really sort of significant and important to their worldview. And I would argue that it's the merging of anti-civilizationism and anti-Westernism that serves today as one of the most important drivers of identity politics. And the influence of this drive, of this momentum, transcends Western cultural institutions and even shapes the attitudes of opponents of the West throughout the world. And that's why you'll find that very often the fiercest sort of Islamic ideologues who denounce the West, sort of routinely and all the time, are often using the language of Western identity politics to express themselves. They're not aware of that. Maybe some of them are. But there's a kind of unacknowledged borrowing of what was produced in the 1960s on their behalf. And that becomes really quite important. And I think it's really important to understand that it is the common hatred of Western civilization that unites and is able to unite the most disparate of movements, such as LGBTQ and trans activists, with that of Hamas, almost unthinkingly. Without a blink of an eye, you just know that on October the 8th, they will be on this side. They will be very clearly on the side of Hamas. Without even a second's thought, it's something that happens spontaneously because of the way that kind of cultural politics or identity works and plays itself out. And in many respects, the sentiment that I described was affirmed very, very clearly. I mean, there's no better example of this than a post on X last week by the Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine, which stated, and I love this sentence because it so clearly sums up everything that we're discussing. It basically says, we are Westerners fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization, right? And not the semi-eradication of Western, not just the bad parts of Western civilization, but the total eradication of Western civilization. Now, you might think that they're exaggerating, the young students, they get carried away, but there's a kind of emotional reaction that builds up on the basis of certain cultural assumptions, which then acquires a momentum of its own, which becomes increasingly, in a sense, integral to the way that they are. And they then go on to say, we are Westerners fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization, and we stand in full solidarity with every movement for liberation in the global South. And then they go on to say, our intifada is an international one. And the use of the word intifada, again, is not accidental. It's not like they couldn't think of a better word. They could have said our struggle, for example, or our fight, but instead they chose the word intifada. And I think the reason why they chose that word is to signal the fact that the kind of struggle that they're engaged with is comparable to the struggle that Hamas and other Islamist forces are fighting throughout the world. And this is in Columbia University in New York, it used to be a good university. I mean, I did lectures there. There were normal people there in those days. You went to the senior common room and you can argue and debate with people. I go there now and it's like you're Dracula, and you're seen as representing the worst. Anyways, the call by Westerners for a total eradication of Western civilization is symptomatic of a willingness of sections of society to embrace anti-civilizationism as a form of their identity, a new identity. And this is really important. I think the reason why this discussion is important isn't just merely because historically and philosophically we're interested in Western civilization, which is quite legitimate, but because without using the word, without using that term, anti-civilizationism, and anti-Western civilization in particular, has become an integral identity that doesn't necessarily express itself in those words, but those kind of ideas, in a sense, feeds the ideological outlook of identity politics. And it's something that we have got to deconstruct and bring to the surface, because they themselves are often unaware of how deeply they become committed to this particular outlook about the world. So anti-civilizationism isn't just merely an attitude in the 21st century, it also represents a form of identity. And this is an orientation that does not simply reject the values of Western civilization, but also the norms of behavior associated with it, okay? So it isn't just simply an ideological rejection of Western civilization, it also represents a complete repulsion of the way Westerners are behaving, or the ideals of behavior that are associated. So in recent times, anti-civilizationism has increasingly led to what can best be described as the process of de-civilization. Referring to the work of Ramin Jahanbegloo, an Iranian philosopher, Paranjapi noted that in recent times, civilizational battles have been redrawn. He adds that the fight is not between two meanings of civilization, but between civilization itself and a rampant worldwide de-civilizing narrative, counter-narrative. And when I read these words, I said, hooray, finally somebody has seen the light. I was also very disappointed that he used the word de-civilization in this eloquent manner. And Jahanbegloo hints that the latter, by de-civilization, has also caused religious or ideological fanaticism. And the fanaticism of Hamas, or the nihilistic zealotry of movements like Black Lives Matter and trans activism, are really an expressions of this de-civilizing counter-narrative. Now, de-civilization does not merely breed irrational and fanatical attitudes towards civilization, but it also seeks to dissolve the practice of civility, the practice of civility that emerged through the civilizing of human behavior. Civility, as you will have read, emerged with this transformation of standards of behavior through the centuries. It refers to becoming less violent. We don't, when we have a dispute, we don't just kill each other or beat each other up, but we find other ways of resolving differences. It becomes more tolerant. It realizes that there's got to be a bit of give and take in the way that human beings interact with each other. It begins to think that polite behavior is actually a standard to aspire to, that being polite is really a positive attribute of human conduct. And it becomes rational. It realizes that reasoning, rather than just merely lashing out or just relying on instinct and emotion, is a sufficient way of dealing with a variety of different issues. And civilization provides us with all kinds of insights, both about ourselves and about other people, and how we behave with each other. And that is something really quite important, because it's an everyday dimension of our experience. Being civilized, acting in a civil way, is really important for us to make our way in the world. We know what the boundaries are. They're very clear boundaries in the way that we behave. We can more or less tell how far to push, what can I get away with, and where should I stop when I talk to somebody. You know that when you see somebody who's totally disabled, and is just there, you don't laugh at that person, you don't make fun of that person, you don't sort of treat that person as somehow an inferior non-entity, but you try to do what you can to support and help that kind of individual. All these things are really essentially part of civility. Now, this civilization represents the opposite of civility, because what these civilizational ideals try to do is to call into question the standards of behavior, the taken for granted assumptions that emerged over the centuries. I mean, you can see that very, very clearly, most strikingly in the trans discussion, where there's this attempt to erase the boundary that distinguishes man from woman. You can see the same kind of impulse that is leading at the moment to gradually erode the boundary that separates adults from children. You can see a similar impulse and I know that Anne is going to talk about it tomorrow, that gradually erodes the distinction between humans and animals. All these things that are, in a sense, have been built up to the historical development of civilization and civility are now called into question in all kinds of different ways to the decivilizational process. In his account of the issues at stake, Yahan Beglu is concerned with what has been lost in the anti-civilizational turn of society. This author of the book, The Decline of Civilization, correctly asserts what as many people have failed to grasp, which is that the true expressions of deciviliation are meaninglessness and thoughtlessness. That kind of sense of meaninglessness and thoughtlessness is integral to the whole decivilization dynamic. And you saw that very, very clearly on the 7th of October and the behavior, but even more strikingly in the reaction to it by many Westerners, that sense of thoughtlessness and meaninglessness. And the devastating consequences of this development are continually and amply demonstrated in the anti-civilizational behavior of so many organizations and movements, both outside of the West in the Middle East, but also within the West itself. It's very tempting and it's very attractive to blame Hamas or to blame Islamists or to blame a wide variety of movements because of their uncivilized or decivilized kind of behavior. It's very, very easy to do that. It's obvious. You don't need a PhD in political science to see what's in front of your eyes, although obviously millions of people have failed to do that in the West. But the responsibility for unleashing the attitudes associated with decivilizationalism originates with the willingness of the ruling elites of the West to refuse to uphold their own civilizational legacy. Confusion, disorientation, and the crisis of meaning has provided a fertile terrain for the flourishing for self-consciously anti-civilizational identities. I think this is very important for us to understand, because in the way we look at the world, there seems to be such a striking, almost physical contrast between what's happening over there and the way we lead our lives over here. There seems to be such a big contrast between the behavior and the attitudes of a variety of forces, that kind of happen. I always think that the same people that denounce child soldiers or child labor in Africa or in India, and have this desire to kind of protect the children of Africa and of India from their parents, almost thoughtlessly, and therefore express the most insidious form of colonial and imperialist ideals, at the same time as expressing that, are going on about the problem of white privilege, right, and of white superiority. And there's almost this kind of thoughtlessness on their part in the way that they've become complicit and provided the moral and the intellectual resources for the horrific things that are taking place in many, many parts of the world. And that, to me, is truly a tragedy. But the biggest tragedy of all is that so many people, particularly of the younger generations, have become enveloped and have become educated and indoctrinated to the point at which they think that this decivilizational turn is really cool. It's really the way to be. And therefore, invariably are pulled into movements that are playing this role of further eroding what is left of civility and the civilizational dynamic. So for me, I think what's important, what our job is to challenge the decivilizational ambition of identity politics. Our job should be not just to defend Western civilization, because being defensive is never a good place to be in, but to actually take the initiative and demonstrate that it is only by drawing on the intellectual and moral resources of Western civilization that humanity and all of humanity can move forward in a way that is desirable and positive. And I know it sounds horrible in the 21st century for one person to say that Western civilization is the only civilization that has got this capacity to renew humanity's ambition and purpose. It's the only civilization that's able to give meaning to experience that can actually provide a more emphatic, universal way of looking at things. But history has shown that for all its horrible errors, for all its thoughtless faults, for all of the atrocities that were committed in its name over the centuries, its outlook on the world as systematically developed both by a variety of intellectual forces, from Christianity to the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, all the way to today, have become really crucially important and significant in pointing the way forward. And that has got to be stated confidently in an ambitious manner, rather than just simply pretending that Western civilization is just another civilization. Thank you.